Hello everyone, and welcome to the webinar on alternative research methods. My name is Jim Ross. I'm a senior user experience architect here at Infragistics Services Group. And so today we're going to talk about some alternative user research methods that you don't often hear about in user experience research. So first, let me tell you a little bit about myself. As I said, I'm a senior user experience architect here at Infragistics in the Services Group. I've been doing user experience work for about 13 years as a user researcher and designer. So just to set some expectations about what we'll be talking about in this webinar, we'll be talking about participant observation and covert observation and comparing these with traditional user research, talking about the advantages and disadvantages of each, when you would actually use these methods and how to perform them. So we're not going to really talk about how to do traditional user research. We will talk about it as in comparison to these other methods, but if you're looking for a how-to guide to traditional user research, that could be a whole webinar or several in and of itself. So saying that, we will talk about traditional user research to tell a little bit about what it is here. So the goal of all user research is really to understand what are the user characteristics, what are their behaviors like, what are their tasks that they perform, what kind of technology or tools do they use to perform those tasks, and what is the environment like, both the physical environment that they work in and the social environment, so the people that they work with, the groups that they interact with. And then so we gather all that knowledge to really design an effective user experience, an experience that meets their needs, allows them to achieve their goals, allows them to do things easily and effectively, and also pleasurably, with having fun. So user research really involves a combination of a spectrum really from interviews to observation in the field. So we call it in the field because we're going out to where the people are. So we're going to their workplaces, to their homes, to see what they do naturally. So these techniques are really on a spectrum with interviews, pure interviews, just asking questions on the left end of the spectrum, to pure observations on the right end of the spectrum, where you're just sitting back and observing what people do without asking questions, without trying to affect what they do. And somewhere in the middle is a technique called contextual inquiry, which is kind of a combination of an interview and an observation, where you're asking the participant to walk through a process and actually do the process, but demonstrate it and talk to you about what they're doing at each step, and you're asking questions as they go along. So these methods are overt. The participants are aware that they're being studied, so we inform them about what we're doing in the study, and they give their consent to participate, and that's called informed consent. And usually it's pretty obvious because we're standing there right next to them, looking over their shoulder, they're talking to us, we're asking questions. These techniques are also non-participant, and what that means is the researcher sits back and observes and questions them, but doesn't participate in the activity. The people themselves are doing the activities, but the researcher is not joining along and doing the same activities with the people that are being observed. So we've adapted these user research methods from ethnographic methods that were used in anthropology originally, and also became used in sociology and the other social sciences. But we really haven't adopted two signature methods that are used frequently in anthropology and sociology and psychology, and these are participant observation and covert observation. So participant observation is what you think about when you think about an anthropologist going to New Guinea, let's say, and living with a group of people and living with them for a long period of time, and not only observing them and asking questions, but actively participating in their society, joining in their tasks and experiencing things firsthand, what these people go through, to get a real good understanding of what their lives are like. One of the first people to do this was Bronislaw Malinowski. He was an anthropologist who, in the early 1900s, visited a lot of different groups to live with them and participate in their activities to better understand them from a first-hand perspective. Another example is sociologist William White, who in the 1930s in Boston joined up with a street gang to learn about their sort of subculture. And he wrote a book about this called Street Corner Society in 1943. Covert observation involves observing people without their knowledge, so it's covert, in public places, and the goal is really to see what people naturally do when they don't know they're being observed. So one of a famous example of this is the psychologist Stanley Milgram. He observed people in New York at subway stations and train stations in the late 60s and early 70s to see what they did while they were waiting in line and did they interact with other people. And he found that a lot of people saw the same people every day waiting for the same trains at the same time, but they didn't ever talk to each other or introduce each other. So he called this the familiar stranger effect, and he wrote a paper and a book about this. Other examples of covert observation are, there's been a lot of studies on the effect of smoking bans in cities. When cities ban smoking in all restaurants and bars, there's been studies of what do people do? Where do smokers go to smoke? Do they stop smoking as much? Where do they smoke outside? Do they avoid going to these places? Also, hand washing studies. You may have heard about these studies of how many people actually wash their hands after they use a public restroom. And you can see how something like that would have to be covert research, because you couldn't use a survey or interviews, because people, if you ask people, do you usually wash your hands, almost everybody would say yes, because there's sort of a social norm that you should wash your hands, and people don't want to sound disgusting. If you did overt research and the researcher was obviously standing there taking notes, people would be kind of creeped out, first of all. And second of all, that would affect their behavior. Much more people would wash their hands if they know that they're being watched and recorded. So you do it covertly, you see what people really actually do. So this made me think, would participant observation or covert observation be useful in user experience research? So let's look at these different research methods, compare them by these four aspects on this quadrant, whether they're overt, covert, non-participant, or participant. So traditional user research methods are overt, where the people know that they're being studied, and they're non-participant, which means the researcher does not participate in their activities. So these are things like user interviews, contextual inquiries, which again are where the participant demonstrates their tasks and walks you through their tasks and thinks aloud and tells you what they're doing, and you observe and ask questions as you have questions as they come up. Could be shadowing, where you follow a person around throughout a period of time, such as following a doctor around during his or her daily routine to see what they do, and then asking questions at various points to clarify what you see. Or it could be just sitting back and observing what people naturally do without interacting with them. So pure observation. In this case, the participants do know that they're being observed, but otherwise you just kind of sit back and try to remain inconspicuous and take notes. The advantages of traditional user research are it's highly ethical because you're getting informed consent. You're telling the participants what's involved and making sure that they consent to be part of the research. You can observe things up close, so that's why it's been often used in user experience, because we're often looking at how people are using computer interfaces or mobile interfaces. You can ask questions and discuss things with people and have them think aloud and tell you what they're thinking. So you can understand a lot about why people do what they do, and you can ask questions about them. It's much easier to observe and take notes when you're being overt and people know that you're a researcher. And it's also easier to take notes when you're not participating in the activity. You're just sitting back and observing. It's much more traditional, so it's easier for clients to understand why you would want to do this kind of research in a project. It's easier for the participants to understand what you're doing, and so it's easier to explain to people. It's more acceptable. And the sessions can be shorter and much more targeted. So you can have 2-hour sessions with people, and during that 2 hours you can ask them to show you a variety of different tasks that you're interested in that may not naturally occur during that 2 hours. Maybe there's a reporting process they do at the end of the month, and you can ask them to show you how they normally do that and walk you through that. So you can really kind of target what you're interested in a much more sort of efficient period of time than these other methods. The disadvantages of this research are, as you see in this Far Side cartoon, these villagers are saying, "Anthropologist, anthropologist," and they're hiding away their TVs and VCRs and things and lamps. So this is an effect called the Hawthorne effect that's after a study that was done in the early 1900s where they concluded that observation affects behavior. So when people know they're being observed, it affects what they do. They act differently. So they may be more conscientious about what they're doing. They may be more efficient. They may, just actively think more about what they're doing. And so it changes what people say and what they do when they know they're being observed. And that's just something we can't get around. Also, participants can feel awkward. Generally, people feel much more comfortable when they're in their own environment and we come to them than when you bring them into the artificial environment of a usability lab or a focus group facility. So people generally do feel much more comfortable, but it's still not entirely natural to have a couple people come to your office or to your home and ask you a lot of questions and look over your shoulder and take a lot of notes and record you. It's not totally natural, so some people can feel a little bit awkward and strange, and it may affect what they do. It's difficult to see the entire context, so when you're scheduling these 2-hour sessions, people kind of go into interview mode. They know that, this is not they're not doing their regular job or tasks for those 2 hours. They're doing what you ask them to show you. So although it's very targeted, you can ask them to show you tasks that they do at different times during that 2-hour period. You're not seeing exactly what normally happens during those tasks. They may forget to tell you certain things. Other people may not interrupt like they normally do during those tasks because they know you're in the middle of a session. So it's slightly artificial. So when would you use traditional user research? When you're trying to observe up-close interactions, you need to see how people use a computer, or mobile device user interface or some kind of tool or product up close. When you need to have questions and have discussion and understand what people are thinking and why they're doing what they're doing, then it needs to be overt. When you're doing research in private locations, you can't be covert. You need to be overt about what you're doing and get people's consent. When you have less time and money, traditional user research is much more targeted and much more efficient than some of these other methods. So next we'll look at participant observation, and this is where the participants, it's overt, the people know that they're being studied, and the researcher observes and asks questions, but also participates in the activities, joins in with what the users are doing. So for example, if you were looking at a call center to try to understand the software that they use and also their work processes and their tasks and their group dynamics and things like that, you could observe them and ask questions, but you could also then participate in their activities. So go through maybe a day or two of training and then join in and become, for at least a few days, a call center worker yourself and answer calls and use the software. And that would really give you a first-hand view of what these people go through and some of the situations that they face. Another example is working as a person in the Department of Motor Vehicles to see what kind of situations that customers come in with and what kind of problems that these workers face. Or working in a hospital emergency room as an administrative person, a receptionist, seeing what the patients do and what the doctors and nurses do. Or working in an airline as a person who checks in bags. So the advantages of participant observation is that you get a much more in-depth understanding of the users, their tasks, their tools, and the environment. So you get much more empathy because you're experiencing firsthand what these people go through. And you observe over a longer period of time, and you experience a greater variety of different situations. So you see a lot more than you would in a 2-hour time period, and the tasks are more natural. It's what naturally happens. You tend to notice things that experienced participants take for granted. So people who have been doing this for a long time may forget about some of the things that they had to learn or they experienced when they first started. But as a new person, you notice things that people have just grown to take, just as natural. The disadvantages are it's time consuming. So it doesn't need to take weeks or months or years, but you can sort of target it and limit it to specific things you want to observe and participate in. but it generally does take longer than traditional user research. So it generates a lot more notes and a lot more data that you have to analyze. It can be difficult to participate and also observe and take notes all at the same time, so you can't really take as detailed notes. And some groups you're not going to be able to join because you need specialized knowledge to join them. You can't be a nurse in a hospital. They're not going to allow you to do that. Or you can't be a doctor or a lawyer or a molecular biologist. Requires too much background knowledge to just join and participate in their activities. So it's just not possible with certain groups to participate. Also, your presence and activities can inadvertently influence what other people do. So just the fact that you're there and you're a new person, that these people have to answer your questions and show you what to do, can affect what they would normally do. So you may not be seeing natural behavior just because of your presence. Another danger is you can lose your objectivity and become biased. So a common saying in user experience is, you are not the user. So what that means is, don't design for your own experiences. Don't think that you are one of the users. And in participant observation, you can fall prey to that by thinking, oh, I'm experiencing this, so I know what the problems are. You have to keep that separation that, yes, this is a method for you to learn more about what the participants go through, but you still don't want to just take your own experiences into account. So when would you use participant observation? Well, when you're studying things that take up a large portion of time, such as processes, workflows, services that are provided, or applications or tools or products that people use for a large portion of their time. You wouldn't use it to study how people do online shopping, on e-commerce sites, because that's kind of a infrequent, short activity, or how people, do their personal income taxes once a year. You wouldn't use it for that. You do it when you want to get a very in-depth understanding of a group and their activities. And it has to be for activities that you can participate in, that you have the background knowledge and you can get up to speed reasonably quickly in. Also, when you have a lot of time for research. So again, you can keep it focused and limited, but it is going to take a lot more time than traditional user research. So the next one is covert observation. So this is covert, which means the people don't know that you're observing them. And it's non-participant, which means the researcher does not participate in the activities. So the researcher just stays back and observes what naturally happens without people knowing what's going on. So an example of this could be in a grocery store. How do people use the self-checkout machines? So you could kind of hang back and people might think that you're a shopper, or you could be look like a worker in the grocery store, and you could see, what do people do when they use these shopping machines? What kind of common problems do people have? When do they get frustrated? When does the cashier have to come over and help them out with what kind of things? Do people actually try to steal things by not, purposely not scanning certain things, sneaking it through? Or another example is, how do people use interactive exhibits in museums, and which ones attract people's attention, and do they find interesting and engaging, and do they learn from? And which ones do people try out and then quickly abandon because they're boring or frustrating or just don't provide any value? Or you could evaluate services. So the check-in process at an airport, when does it get bogged down? What kind of problems do people have? What kind of things could be improved in this service? Or the security process, security screening. When does it slow down? What kind of issues slow down? How could the physical layout be designed better? How could the services be improved to make it easier for the customers, but also easier for the TSA without, really inconveniencing either group? How could you improve that experience? One real example of this was a study done by Stephen Huber and some of his colleagues. They went out and observed, how do people really hold their mobile devices? And they did 1,333 observations of, those people just in public, and seeing how they hold their mobile devices, and comparing, what are the most common ways that people hold them, and how should this affect the placement of objects on the screen? So that's an article you can read on UX Matters at this link here. So the advantages of covert observation is it completely eliminates that Hawthorne effect, the effect that we have on participants. They don't know they're being observed, so it doesn't affect their behavior. So for example, the example of people studying how people use a museum exhibit. If you do covert research, you can just watch and see, how long people interact with it and what they do, and what, do they get bored? Do they stay there for a long time and get really engaged? If you did overt research and you went up to people and said, show me how you would use this museum interface, this exhibit. Show me what you would normally do. People are going to end up spending a lot more time considering it and looking through it than they would normally if they didn't know they were being observed. Just because you're asking them to, they're going to spend a lot more time. So you're not going to see really what they would really do with this interface. So you can really observe natural behavior because you're just seeing what people are actually doing in the real world. And you can observe many different people in situations in a short period of time. So an example, the Department of Motor Vehicles, you could go there and sit there all day long and see a huge number of people with different kind of situations, different kind of problems, and you could see, what kind of problems do people have? How long do they have to wait there? When do people get frustrated? What kind of things could be improved in this service? In a really short period of time, you can observe that. You don't have to recruit or schedule participants. That's the sort of the easy thing. And that can take up a lot of time and money and just administrative difficulty. When you're just going out and seeing people that are already naturally there, you save yourself that problem. Some of the disadvantages are, though, you can't always see close-up interactions. So something like an ATM machine, you can't just stand and look over people's shoulders because they're going to wonder, they're going to think you're trying to steal their PIN number. You could look over their shoulder if it was an overt research session and you got their permission. So looking at something like an ATM machine in a covert study, you can see how people line up for it. When it gets busy, do people take their receipts? You can see things from afar, but you can't see the up-close interaction. Although you can in certain circumstances, like how people use an interactive exhibit in a museum, you can walk right up to it and look at it too, and people might just think that you're another museum patron. A big problem with covert observation is you can't ask questions, and you can't understand what people are thinking. They're not thinking aloud. You can't always hear them, what they're doing and saying, because you're at a slight distance. So you end up seeing what people do, but you don't necessarily get the answers to why they do what they do. And so that's one of the problems. So you can end up having to make a lot of interpretations, and you may end up with a lot of additional questions based on what you observe. Because you have to be covert, you can't obviously be watching people, you can't obviously be taking notes, so you have that difficulty of trying to watch people subtly and take brief notes. There's also ethical concerns that people have raised. Are you invading people's privacy? You're not informing them about your study and they're not giving consent to be part of it. So is that unethical? So really you can only use it in public places to be ethical, where there's no expectation of privacy. So as long as you're seeing what anybody else in that public place could be noticing on their own, then it is considered ethical. So when would you use covert observation? Well, it has to be in public places, obviously, to be ethical. And when you're observing things that can be observed at a moderate distance, such as behavior, services that are provided, processes overall, and interactions with other people and with technology. It's when you don't need to see the up-close details, when you're not interested in, what are people doing on this interface here that you're seeing in this picture. And when you don't need to ask questions or have discussion or understand what they're thinking. So the fourth method here is covert participant observation. So again, covert, the people don't know they're being observed, but it's participant, the researcher is participating in the activities. So this is kind of like being a spy, going undercover. So for instance, if you joined a company as a new employee and you worked in this department and you observed their work processes and their communication styles and what they did and their tasks, and how well and how efficiently it worked. But if you didn't tell them that you're doing a study, then that's covert and you're participating in the activities. So this has been used a lot in psychology studies, but it's also been criticized a lot for being very unethical because you're actively deceiving people. You have to lie to them. You're having this cover, and they don't know that they're part of this study, and you're doing it often in private locations where people do have an expectation of privacy. So this differs from covert non-participant observation, because in covert non-participant observation, you're just going out in a public place where there's no expectation of privacy and just seeing what naturally happens. You're not actively telling people that you're something that you're not. Whereas here, in this case, you are having to deceive people. The advantages, of course, is people don't know that they're being observed, so it eliminates that whole effect that we have on participants. So you see natural behavior, and people feel very comfortable because they don't know that they're being studied. But the disadvantages, obviously, are it's considered very unethical because people aren't informed about what you're doing, and they're not giving their consent. You're actively having to deceive them, to tell them that you're something that you're not, and you're doing this in private places, so it could be an invasion of privacy. It's also, just from a practical standpoint, it's difficult to join certain groups. So when you're overt and you're telling people that you're a researcher, it's hard enough to join certain groups, but at least they know that, oh, well, you don't know what you're doing because you're a researcher and you have to learn. Okay, I accept that. But when you're covert, you're pretending that you know what you're doing, and so that makes it difficult to join certain groups. You often don't have the background knowledge to join those groups and pass yourself off as a legitimate person to join that group. And you may not fit the profile in terms of age or anything like that. You also have the burden of maintaining your cover. So you have to have a cover story, you have to live up to this. There's also the risk of discovery, which could make people very angry if they find out that you've been deceiving them and studying them without their knowledge. And it also eliminates the possibility of doing any follow-up research. So you can't go back to them later and say, okay, actually I was just a researcher. I wasn't part of your group. I was doing a study, so now can I interview you? That usually doesn't go over too well. So I would say not to use covert participant observation. It's very highly controversial, and it has a lot of ethical problems, so it really shouldn't be used. So next we'll talk about how to do participant observation and covert observation. How would you actually do a participant observation? What are some of the steps involved? So again, just to review, participant observation is where the people know that they're being studied and the researcher is actually participating in the activities. So again, the example of joining a call center and working for a few days as a call center worker to really understand firsthand what they go through. So you want to start out doing some initial research to really understand the domain, the characteristics of the users, their tasks and behaviors, and any of the existing research that's already been done that's out there. So all of this will help you become a participant in these groups. You have to have some of that background knowledge. This will help you get up to speed faster by having this knowledge. Then you want to plan what you need to observe. So with any research, user research, you need to do some planning up front and determine what are your goals, what kind of things do you want to know, and that sort of thing. But it's especially important in participant observation because in most projects, you're not going to have weeks or months or years to live with these people or to participate in their activities. So you really have to target it to make it practical. You have to target it to, what types of people do we want to observe and participate in those groups? What kind of activities do I need to experience and participate in for this? And when is the best time to observe those activities? Are those activities naturally going to happen during the time that we have to do this research? So if it's something that only happens at the middle of the year and it's the beginning of the year, you're not going to be able to actually participate in those activities. So you really want to limit it down to the things that you need to observe and participate in so that this takes up a reasonable amount of time. So you want to determine how much time do you need to spend participating in these activities. So it depends on the number of different user groups that you want to join and observe, the number of different activities, tasks, and situations that you want to experience and participate in, and when those actually happen. And then also the complexity of the domain. So if it's a very simple sort of domain, simple activities that you're participating in, it doesn't take as long to learn. There's not as much to experience. But if it's very complex, you may have to be there for a longer period of time to really understand what's going on and to see all the different types of activities that you're interested in. Then decide on the number of observers, the number of researchers that are going to go out and participate in these activities. So if you have multiple people, researchers going out and observing and participating, that gives you a greater reliability of data. So if one researcher notices something, you don't know, is that something that always happens? Is that something that's specific to this particular group? If you have multiple researchers doing this, you can compare notes and see how often, whether this is something common across all these different groups or not. It also gives you a lower chance of bias. There's those biases that can creep in, such as influencing the other people by your presence, or designing for yourself, thinking that you are the user. When you have several people, it kind of keeps you honest, and people can spot where there might be bias. It's also just good to have other people to discuss the findings and to compare what you observed, and to, more than one head is better than one. So what you want to do is you want to join the group, and in anthropology and sociology, they call it using a gatekeeper and using key informants. So the gatekeeper is the person, a highly influential person in the group that can get you introduced to the group and get you acceptance right away and make you seem legitimate and trustworthy. So this is somebody that can help explain why you're there and what you're trying to do, and try to make people feel comfortable with you. Then once you're in the group, you use key informants, and these are sort of the key people who know everything about the group, maybe people who have been there a long time, people who can also help sort of pave the way and make other people feel comfortable with you. So these are well-respected, very knowledgeable people in the group that can kind of get you up to speed and answer a lot of questions that you have. You need to earn people's trust and acceptance. At first, people may find it a little strange what you're doing. They're not used to it. So you want to build rapport with these people so that they understand what you're doing, and you want to listen to them, be respectful, obey the group rules, both the written rules and the unwritten rules that you discover. And you want to be discreet and kind of blend into the group. I mean, it's overt. They know that you're doing a research study, but you don't want to be the loudest, most outgoing, obnoxious, standout kind of person. You want to just kind of blend in and let them sort of focus on their own activities, and after a while forget about the fact that you're doing a research study. So when you're observing and you're participating in these activities, you can only really take brief notes. So don't worry about trying to capture everything. Rely more on your memory. Just jot down brief things occasionally that will serve to jog your memory to certain things later. And then take breaks at various points throughout the day to go off somewhere else to expand upon your notes. So first type up what you remember from the top of your head, then look at your notes to sort of jog your memory about different things. And you want to do this, and expand the detail as much as possible, as soon as possible after you experience it, while you can still, while it's still fresh in your mind. And you want to do this away from the other participants and go somewhere else. So they know that you're a researcher doing a study, but they don't need to see you typing up your notes and then wondering, ooh, what are they writing about me? And you don't want to just constantly remind them of the fact that you're studying them, even though they do know that. Don't worry about recording. It isn't really that important. You're rarely going to have time to go back. You won't have time to go back and listen to everything. Recording, video recording especially, can make people feel uncomfortable. Audio is a little bit less uncomfortable and more unobtrusive, but you always have to make sure you notify people and get their permission to do recording, and make sure you protect their privacy of these recordings so people don't get in trouble from this. You should analyze your notes and what your findings iteratively. Don't wait until the end. If you wait until the end, you're going to have so much data that it's just going to be overwhelming. If you stop and analyze the data at various points throughout the process, you can see what it is you're learning. Are you gathering everything that you wanted to know? Are there additional questions that came up or additional activities that you want to observe? You can change and tweak your process as you're going through and look at different things and refine your research based on what you found up to that point. And then always watch out for those biases that we talked about before. Remember that you're participating in the activities, but you're not a participant. You are not the user. And monitor yourself, see, is what you're doing affecting the participants? Are they doing things differently because of you? So at some point you have to end the research. You can't be out there again practically you can't be there for weeks or months. So at some point you should feel like you've gained all the information that you really need and end the research. Make sure you thank the participants. You want to be able to get their contact information. You may have additional questions later that you may email them or go back to do some regular user interviews and things like that. So you want to remain on a good rapport with them. So next, how do you do covert observation? What are some of the tips to do a covert observation? So again, covert observation, going out into public places, observing people covertly, and not participating in the activities. Just sitting back and watching what people naturally do in public places. So again, first you want to plan what you want to observe, just like you normally would. What kind of things do you want to learn? Now, again, this is really important for covert research, because it's not just people watching. You might think it's really simple just going out in a public place and seeing what people do. If you did that, you would either have no idea what really to capture, so you either capture everything or you capture nothing, or you just be overwhelmed by so much to look at and to observe and capture. You'd miss a lot of things. So you really need to kind of narrow it down to what things do you want to look for before you go out there. So you want to do some initial research again on the domain, the users, their tasks, see what kind of information is already out there, has been published. So you really know what to look for and what's important to focus on when you go out there. And then also to make sense of what you observe so that you kind of have some background information about maybe the common issues that people face or the common problems. So you know to look for those things and you can kind of understand what people are doing and why they're doing what they're doing. You want to scope out the location ahead of time. What's the layout like? Where do these activities that you want to see take place? Where's a good place for you to stand or sit, and observe unobtrusively? What are the people like? What do they do while they are in that space? And how do they dress? And that's important to show you what to dress like and what you should be doing while you're observing so that you don't stand out. What's the activity level like? When's a good time of the day to go observe? Maybe you want to see when the activity is really busy or when it's very slow to see differences. You might want to notify management and security so that you don't appear suspicious or get arrested. So for example, if you're in an airport and you're watching the security screening process, you want to get permission for that ahead of time because you're going to look suspicious and people are going to wonder. It's a good idea to observe with partners, have other researchers or designers go out with you. The good thing about this is it avoids missing things, so you're always going to miss things, but if you have more heads than one, somebody's going to notice things. You could each focus on different things, and then that gives you less, each person has less that they have to observe, and they can focus on different aspects or different activities. Or you can observe from different vantage points and you might notice different things. And just by having other people, everybody has a different perspective on what they see. And it's helpful to have people to discuss the findings afterwards, see what you noticed in common, see what's different about what you noticed, and discuss the implications together. It's better to observe over several shorter sessions than one big all-day session. So the thing is, you end up seeing more people in different types of situations. And you see variations over different days or different times of day. It's easier for people to remain sharp and avoid fatigue and avoid being overwhelmed with data if you do a shorter session than being there all day. So it's much easier for you to remember what you observed after a 2-hour period and you go type up your notes than if you were there all day. And if you're there for a shorter period of time, you're less likely to get caught and noticed that you've been hanging around there all day versus a shorter period of time. So you want to blend in, you're not being a spy or anything, but you want to dress like everybody else, do what other people are doing so you don't stand out. You want to have a relaxed posture, and have normal eye contact. You don't want to look like you're observing people. A good thing to use is a smartphone or a tablet for cover. That gives you something to do when you're not looking at people. You can pretend like you're looking at your phone and doing something on there. You can't really take obvious notes, obviously, so you should focus more on observing and just rely on your memory. Take brief notes to jog your memory later. And this is another great reason for using a smartphone or a tablet is you can take notes on there, and it looks like you're just texting someone or answering an email, and people think nothing of it, and it's a great way to have cover and also take some notes. Recording really isn't important, so don't worry about that. You may want to take photos or video, but save that for the end, because if people notice you, it's kind of obvious when you're taking photos and video. So if you get caught or noticed, it doesn't matter because it's the end of your research anyway. But photos may be useful for presentations to show other people what you saw and also to kind of remember later what you observed. But use a smartphone for photos because phones, you turn off the flash, you turn off the shutter sound, and it's really subtle. People often don't even know you're taking photos. Don't record audio. You're often not close enough to hear anything anyway, and it's illegal to record audio without people's consent in public places. You want to then debrief after each observation session. Immediately after your session, each observer should go away and type up their notes as soon as possible while it's really fresh in your mind. And first it's good to kind of just type up your notes based on what you remember from the top of your mind, and then look at your written notes and see if that sort of jogs your memory and expand upon those. Also, it's good to draw a diagram of the physical space. That can help you sort of remember where things are and what activities took place where. You want to note general observations, general themes that you saw, and events and how they took place. Then get together as a group from time to time to compare your notes and discuss what you observed and talk about whether you need to make any changes to the research based on what you saw. Are there different things you want to focus on? So you want to make sure that you observe ethically. Only do it in public places where there isn't an expectation of privacy, where anybody else could see what you're seeing. You're focusing, remember, on groups. You're not focusing on individuals. You're not following someone. You're not stalking someone. You're not a spy. You're just looking at, in a public place, what do groups of people do. Protect people's privacy. So in your deliverables, don't use photos and things that can identify people. You never know who may see this and who they may know. And you don't have to deceive people. Don't be deceptive. You're out in a public place observing what happens. If somebody notices what you're doing and asks you, you don't have to have a cover. You can just tell them what you're doing and that you're a researcher observing how people do a certain thing, and most people won't be, will think it's interesting. They won't mind that. So I've been talking about these three methods as if they're complete separate individual methods that you would use at different times. But really, it's best to combine these methods. So I've talked about a lot of advantages of these techniques and also a lot of disadvantages of these techniques. And it's really best to combine them. You can take advantage of all the advantages while minimizing the disadvantages. So for example, you could combine covert and overt observation. So a lot of airports, for example, have these new baggage check-in, self-check-in machines where there's no attendant there and the customers are supposed to check in their own bags. So since this is a new technology, you could evaluate it by first doing some contextual inquiries, asking people coming in to show me how you would use this and think aloud and tell me what you're doing as you go through this process. Then you could interview them afterwards about how they felt about the experience and what was confusing and that sort of thing. So you could do that with a bunch of people, maybe 10 people or more, and then say the next day you could go to the airport and just hang back and covertly observe what happens all day. And so that would give you a good idea of what are the common problems that people have, and you already have that those contextual inquiries from the previous day, so you kind of have a good perspective on what the problems are, and you could see how those situations happen. Then you may have some additional questions, and so the next day you could go in and do some more contextual inquiries or some interviews and ask people about certain questions you have about the experience. Also, you could combine participant and non-participant observation. So if you were looking at the people at the airline that check in bags and their process and workflow and the tools that they use, you could start out by doing some non-participant observation where you're interviewing these people, and then you could do some shadowing where you just kind of hang back and watch them do their job all day. And when they have times when they're not busy with customers, you can ask questions about what you observed. Then you could get kind of trained for a while and join in and become one of these airline people that check in bags and experience it yourself, experience a lot of different situations that passengers go through. And then you may have additional questions from that, so you might follow up with some traditional, non-participant interviews or some more contextual inquiries and observations. So, in conclusion, why have we always relied on traditional research and user experience? I think because we were always looking at user interfaces on a computer, desktop computer, a laptop, later mobile devices. But as the definition of user experience has kind of expanded beyond just the user interface to people using devices in multiple places, using these anywhere with tablets and phones and even interfaces within cars and other appliances. As we begin to look at user experience as an actual experience design in, say, a museum, the layout of exhibits and the layout of things in a museum and interactive exhibits. Or we look at, instead of just the user experience of some work enterprise software, we look at what are the processes that these people are doing in addition to the software. What are the other tools that they're using? How are their groups organized? What is their workflow? And we're looking at how business is done more than just business applications. And we begin to look at more than just e-commerce websites and mobile devices and mobile sites. We're looking at the whole customer experience in the stores and the whole experience across channels. Then we can use all three of these methods to really get the best understanding of the user experience. So combining traditional user research with participant observation and covert observation to really take advantage of these techniques and to minimize the disadvantages. So thank you very much. I hope you learned a lot about these alternative user research methods